Is the second gen Duramax Diesel 3-liter engine a good engine? I'm going to tell you what I think as a heavy duty diesel mechanic. What is going on today, guys? My name's Alex. Welcome back to the channel. Today we have this beautiful GMC Elevation, nice blacked out GMC here, but more importantly we have the second gen Duramax, the LZO, and I'm really excited to dive into here as a diesel mechanic, see what they've updated, talk about some things I really like, and then obviously talk about some things that may concern me and some potential issues. So that is what we're doing today. Yeah, she's a good looking truck. This is the Elevation, which I said, it's kind of like a blacked out package, which I think looks pretty flashy. He has the extended wheelbase with the crew cab as well as the 6.5 foot bed, which I actually really like. Makes these trucks pretty utilitarian. I think the front end looks actually really good on these things. I think GM has some good styling with these newer generation of trucks. I really like it. And then he has the X31 off-road package on this thing too. So she's a pretty good looking truck, but more importantly is what's underneath that hood. So for starters, this second gen 3-liter inline 6 Duramax is going to be released with the 2023 GMC Sierras as well as the Chevy pickup trucks. And it is putting out 305 horsepower as well as 495 pound-feet of torque. Now that is an impressive 28 more horsepower as well as 35 more pound-feet of torque than the first generation, which I actually made a video about 6 months ago. So if you're interested in that engine, I'll put a link down below. Now that may not seem that much of a power increase, but what has really increased with this second gen engine is its towing ability. So if you get this LZO Duramax with the max tow package on these trucks now available, you can tow up to 13,300 pounds, which is a 4,000 pound increase in towing ability. So there are some really nice advantages with this second gen Duramax right off the bat. Another nice little bump with this second gen engine is fuel economy. So in the 4-wheel drive versions, the first gen 3-liter Duramax had a combined fuel mileage of 23. This bad boy has a combined fuel mileage of 24. So at least on paper, this thing is going to be slightly more fuel efficient as well as giving you more power and towing ability. Now, speaking of fuel economy, apparently GM said with the release of the first gen, their main concern with this engine was fuel economy. And like I talked about in my first video, that was a little bit of a red flag for me because Ram said the exact same thing about their Eco Diesel, and well, that turned out to be a pile of hot garbage. So I was a little bit concerned with GM saying that. However, they also said they wanted this to be the most reliable diesel engine they have ever made. And so far with the first gens, they have pretty much lived up to that. So it'll be interesting to see if the second gen engines can get that same type of reliability we're seeing with the first gens. So those are the highlights of this 3-liter Duramax. You guys can look up basically anywhere. But to me, what makes this engine special is all in the design. This thing is an inline 6 single turbo dual overhead cam diesel engine, and that exact diesel engine design is in millions and millions of diesel trucks running up and down the highway with those big massive 15-liter engines. And GM has basically just shrunk that down and put it in this small compact package, which is why I really like it. And an inline 6 has 3 major advantages over a traditional V6 or V8. Inline 6 engines are incredibly well naturally balanced engines. And what is that going to do? It's going to minimize vibration, and you don't need any extra components to balance the engine. So a diesel engine naturally has a lot more vibration than a gasoline engine. And so the last thing you want is to have additional vibration. So these things are just phenomenally well balanced, and you don't need to worry about any additional vibrations that you might have with a V8 or a V6. So that's number one. Now, the second advantage of inline 6, and the biggest in my opinion, is that these things are just torque monsters naturally. So with an inline 6, what you get is an under square engine, basically meaning that the stroke of the piston is larger than the bore. That is going to create a mechanical advantage down on the crankshaft. Your crank throw is going to be a lot bigger than something like a V6 or a V8. These engines can create torque very well, very low in the RPM band, which is highly advantageous for trucks. And again, that's why you see almost every single highway truck run this exact same design of diesel engine because it is just phenomenal for pulling and towing. Now, the third advantage of an inline six, in my opinion, is the actual design of the engine bay itself, because an inline six allows for a lot more room versus, let's say, a V8. So this is your engine right here, obviously, and then you have your turbo just sitting wide open here. I mean, you can access it. That's your VGT right back there. You have your sensors here. It's just right there, easy to access. It makes it very easy to work on these engines, which is important if you guys are looking to keep this thing long term. I mean, here's your air intake. It's just, everything is nice and accessible, and there's not too much stuff going on. It makes a lot of sense in an engine bay like this. Now, this 3-liter Duramax will once again come with an aluminum block as well as an aluminum head. GM says this will save about 25% weight in comparison to having an iron block and an iron head. And I honestly can't fault GM for going with an aluminum setup here because this is a light-duty diesel, and I think they correctly valued weight loss over strength in this application. However, the internals of this engine are anything but light-duty. GM went with forged crankshaft, forged connecting rods, forged steel liners. They also went with forged steel pistons, dumping the aluminum alloy pistons from the first gen. So this thing is a very strong engine internally. Now, just like the first gen 3-liter, your gear train is going to be at the rear of the engine. Now, what do I mean by your gear train? Well, typically your gear train is going to run things like your fuel pump, power steering pump, oil pump, and then on your heavy duty engines that I work on, it's also going to run your air compressor and stuff like that. So normally what we see on a US made diesel engine is the gear train is on the front of the engine. Reason being because, well, us North Americans with our trucks, normally there's a big hood or just a normal hood like this, and it makes it accessible to have things up front. We see rear gear trains on stuff like European engines because normally they have a lot of cab overs over there. So I did a little digging because I was curious as to why GM went with a rear gear train on this. So like I suspected, this engine does have some European origins. This engine was co-designed firstly by GM and a German automotive company called Opel. And that is why we probably see the gear train in the back, because these engines probably go into cab overs in Europe, and it makes it a lot easier to service them with the cab over. So there are some pros and cons when it comes to the gear train at the back of the engine versus the front, which we'll get into later in the video. Now, in terms of engine upgrades between the first gen and the second gen, the first major upgrade, which I briefly already said, were the steel pistons. So GM did what Ford did with their new generation of PowerStrokes. They ditched the aluminum alloy pistons for a shorter, stronger steel piston. Now, with steel, it can take a lot more heat, a lot more pressure. But the other good thing is that steel or iron does not expand as much as aluminum, so you can make your tolerances on your engine much, much tighter than you can with an aluminum alloy piston, which is another big benefit. Now, this may seem very obvious, but the last thing you want is to have a heavier rotating assembly in your engine, and obviously steel is heavier than aluminum. But what you can do, and this is what Ford did and this is what GM has done, since steel is so much stronger than aluminum, you can use a lot less of it. So that's why you get those very short pistons, because you don't need as much material. This results in the pistons basically weighing the exact same amount as the previous aluminum pistons. However, they're a lot stronger, they're a lot more heat resistant, and again, your tolerances can be much, much tighter. So that is a really, really good upgrade for this engine. The other thing they did is change the top of the piston shape, which also kind of changes the combustion chamber shape. They say that's going to help reduce emissions and help burn the diesel much more efficiently. So we'll have to see about that. Now, since the pistons are so much shorter, GM had to implement new connecting rods, and they say that the connecting rods are 25% stronger. Again, they are forged connecting rods. GM has also actually strengthened or thickened the cylinder walls, which again are forged steel. So I was not kidding when I said that the internals on this engine are pretty freaking beefy. Now, the other major upgrades comes in the form of more airflow as well as more fueling. So starting with the turbo, you have a revised turbo that can push more into the engine. You have a new cylinder head, which allows for more airflow. You have a new intake cam as well as new intake valves, all of which are designed to push more air into this engine. Now, along with more air, what do you need? You need more fuel. So GM went with brand new injectors, which have much higher flow rates, so you can put much more fuel as well as air into this engine, and that is mostly what is contributing to the boost in power over the first gen, is the additional airflow as well as the higher fueling rates. Now, what I like about these updates is GM really hasn't touched the core or the major design of the engine. What they have done is we just kind of opened it up a little bit. They've allowed for more airflow, more fuel, as well as really strengthened the internals to deal with that extra pressure, extra fuel. So the core design of the engine has not really changed at all. And so this is why I think the second gen engines will just continue to build on the 3-liter Duramax reliability that everyone has seen since 2019 with the first gens. Now, despite me thinking this is going to be a reliable engine, no engine is perfect, as I always say, and this engine will be no exception. However, this engine is still relatively new. I don't think there are enough real world miles put on these engines, at least these second gen engines, to really conclude what some issues will be. However, we'll take a look into what I think that could become issues, or just some general things that I am a little suspicious about if I was going to buy this second gen 3-liter Duramax. Now, luckily the first gen engine didn't really have any major concerns with it, aside from long crank times and no starts. Now, GM has attributed that to a bad cam position sensor, allegedly. So hopefully with this second gen engine, they've taken care of that. The number one thing that people always like to talk about on these engines, at least in my opinion, is the oil pump belt and the service life of it. And the service life of the oil pump belt on the second gen has actually been extended to 200,000 miles from 150,000 miles in the first gen. So I guess that goes to show that GM is confident in the belt enough to extend it another 50,000 miles. But the main issue with that belt is the fact that it's at the back of the engine, and the only way to inspect it and or change it is to remove the transmission from the truck. That, as you guys can probably imagine, is not the simplest job, nor the most inexpensive job. So if you guys are planning on keeping these engines for a long period of time, you will at some point probably have to remove the transmission and change that oil pump belt, unfortunately. Now, GM says that the reason they had to put the oil pump belt on the back of the engine has to do with the length of an inline 6 engine, and that is true. Inline 6 engines tend to be very lengthy, but it would have been nice to see GM somehow figure out to put the belt on the front of the engine, or do what all the heavy duty engines do and just have the oil pump on an actual gear train, seeing that the gear train's already at the back of the engine. So it would have been nice to see GM put a gear driven oil pump down there, but it is what it is. Now, secondly, speaking of gear train at the rear, so the other thing that you guys are probably gonna have to deal with at some point if you have the vehicle for a long period of time is replacing the fuel pumps. So on a diesel engine, the fuel pumps are running at extremely high pressure, and they are much, much more complex than a fuel pump on a gasoline engine. And like we said, the gear train is at the rear, so the fuel pump is also at the rear of the engine. And in order to change that fuel pump, you have to remove a bunch of stuff, including the oil pan, and it's just not the simplest job. GM says a fuel pump should last up to 100,000 miles, so odds are within the life of the truck, you will have to change that. Now, an advantage of having a gear train at the rear is the fact that the engine is just gonna be quieter, because that gear train is gonna be underneath the cab and you're not gonna hear it as much. So that is one advantage, if you will, of having this type of gear train. Another thing that caught my eye specifically with the second gen is oil consumption. Now, I truly think it is too early to tell whether or not this is really an issue or not, but it seems like people are reporting early on in the life of the engine that this is burning a lot of oil. So I tried to dig a little bit into it, and it does seem like there may be something there, but I think a lot of people are checking their oil too early on in the life of the engine. A new engine is going to burn a lot more oil until it gets broken in, and GM says these engines aren't broken in until 5,000 miles, and they also actually overfill these engines from factory with an extra liter of oil. So they are fully prepared that this thing is going to burn a lot of oil until those piston rings and everything else in the engine is seated perfectly once that break-in period is complete. So if you're looking at buying one of these engines, or you have one of these engines, it is something to monitor. I don't know if I would be panicking yet. I just think it's too early to tell, and it seems like these engines are meant to burn some oil when they are first broken in, so we'll see about that. Now, another thing that really caught my eye was the torque delivery on the second gen versus the first gen 3-liter Duramax. So the first liter Duramax makes its peak torque of 460 foot-pounds at 1,500 RPM, which is quite impressive. That's very down low, and so the torque is really immediate right when you need it, if you're towing, pulling, whatever. Now, this second gen 3-liter makes its peak torque of 495 foot-pounds of torque at over 2,600 RPM. So that's over 1,000 RPM longer for this thing to make its peak torque. Now, GM claims that at 1,500 RPM, both engines are making 460 pound-feet of torque, so you're not losing out on that early rise in torque. But just looking at the torque curves, it does seem like this thing is lacking in its torque generation down low in the RPMs versus the first gen. I don't know conclusively why that is. I would imagine in order to make that extra top end power, the torque band is going to be a little bit slower to get up there. So that is something that caught my eye, that this thing just doesn't make torque as well as the first gen for whatever reason. But I imagine once I get in and drive this thing, it's going to have plenty of power on that top end range over the first gen. Now, I've saved the best for last, and this is the reason why this engine truly kind of steals my heart a little bit as a diesel mechanic, is because of the emissions. We did not hear almost any major emission issues with the first gen 3-liter Duramax, which to me is a massive, massive silver lining when it comes to these modern diesel engines, because that is by far the #1 killer of these modern diesel engines. It's what killed the eco diesel for Ram, and it's what's killing a lot of these new modern diesel engines, is the emissions problem. So I don't know what magic GM is doing, but whatever they're doing, they need to keep doing. And it does seem like they're even improving on that, because with the second gen engine, they've actually moved the DOC catalyst further to the turbo. So that means that it's gonna heat up quicker. And if you guys have been following my videos, getting your emission systems up to temp as fast as possible is critical to increase the life of your diesel emissions as well as your diesel engine. So it is very intriguing, and it's a really good green flag as a heavy duty diesel mechanic to see an engine that is not being absolutely plagued by emissions problems. And so that is why, probably the #1 reason why I really like this engine. All right, guys, to conclude, I generally really like this engine. I love the design. It's an inline 6 single turbo dual overhead cam setup, which again is what millions and millions and millions of highway trucks run every single day down the highway, putting millions of miles on it. And it's just a very reliable engine design. So I like that GM's done that. Secondly, like we just talked about, is the lack of emission related issues, which I think is critical for any modern diesel engine to have success. You can now tow over 13,000 pounds with this engine. It is incredibly fuel efficient. My friend who owns this truck, his average right now is like, I think 7.9 or 8.1 liters per 100 kilometers, which is incredible for a full-size pickup truck. It seems like there's a lot of positives with this Duramax diesel engine right now, and I really, really like it. As always, guys, I'm intrigued what you guys have to say. What do you think about this engine? Do you think I missed anything? Do you guys own one? Do you like it? All that fun stuff. I like reading your comments. But if you did like the video, don't forget to leave that thumbs up. And if you like cool stuff like this, don't forget to subscribe. I'm hoping that I can get a trailer hooked up behind this truck one day and do my, my towing loop and really see how this thing stacks up against something like the EcoBoost, which is, I think, a direct competitor to it. So that'll be fun. But yeah, enough of me. We'll see you in the next freaking video, guys.